Welcome everyone. It's great to be here. So my name's Simon. I lead agriculture and food at a company called Anthesis. We are a global sustainability consultancy and we work right across the agri-food system to support a just and fair transition. And it's great to be able to have the opportunity to talk about the role of alternative protein as a fundamental nutrition source, given the complexities of what we're facing in our current global food system. So before I dive into the session, I wanted to set a brief global context just to set the scene. And I want to look at 2050. So in 2050, there's going to be about 1.5 billion people at risk of a protein deficiency. And that's due to climate and demographic challenges. And a reminder that protein is a fundamental building block for physical and mental health and well-being. If we look at the current sources of protein, we've talked at length today about the role of animal protein, its impact of land use, its impact on natural resources, its impact of taking nutrition and high protein sources from regions that are largely deforested, but also taking it away from the food supply. We also know that it has a significant impact on global greenhouse gas emissions. But in many instances, it also provides a major source of protein and micronutrients to billions of people around the world, particularly in less economically developed areas of the world. And animal protein consumption is forecast to grow in some regions as more countries embrace westernized diets. On the flip side, we already have a significant percentage of the global population who derive most of their protein from plant-based sources. But with the impact of climate and the ever-increasing volatile weather impacting crop stress, rising instances of pest and disease in severe circumstances, we're seeing increasing incidents of total crop failures. And research suggests that it will be impossible to sustain a healthy, sustainable diet for a global population of 10 billion by 2050, and for that population to consume the amount and type of protein typical of North American European diets if we want to achieve the UN SDGs and targets of Paris Climate Agreement. So something fundamentally needs to change. And we have so much exciting technology and innovation in protein science. When we talk about protein science, we're talking about plant-based meat and dairy alternatives, we're talking about insect proteins, we're talking about algae, and we're also talking about cell-based meat. All these things have a critical role to play in accelerating the transition required to ensure that every individual on this planet has equal access to sustainable, healthy, nutritious and affordable food. And we should look at this not just through the lens of human nutrition, but the role that alternative proteins can play in the sense of animal protein and animal nutrition too. But I think the purpose of this session is to think about what we need to get alternative protein to scale. And we'll look at the potential role that alternative protein can play in the future to meet and mitigate the risk of protein deficiency. We'll also look at the opportunities and challenges to scale, but ultimately what role alternative protein could play in the future of global food security, alongside or through replacing existing protein sources. So we have a great panel and we have a mix of perspectives. I'm keen to get as much perspective as possible from investor, from think tank, from Horizon Scanner, but also let's look to explore the role of policy and the role of consumer and education in this process. So we have Joe Raven, who's Director of Thematic Research and Corporate Innovation at FAIR. We have Linus, who is a UK Policy Manager at the Good Food Institute. We have Shivani, who is a Senior Associate at Synthesis Capital. And we have Duncan, who is the Global Strategic Lead for the Food System and Transformation at Form for the Future. A warm welcome to you all. I'd like to kick this debate off with a brief question and response. It would be really interesting to just understand your own personal interest in alternative proteins. So if we start with Joe, perhaps.
Hi everyone. Well, first of all, for those of you who aren't familiar with the FAIR initiative, we are a network of institutional investors, so over 400 institutional investors, asset owners, asset managers, representing over 70 trillion, and we focus specifically on the protein sector, so looking at novel technologies, but also looking at traditional meat, dairy, and farm fish, and what does that mean for investment portfolios, and what are the opportunities associated with that. And the topic of alternative proteins has been on our radar for, well, since its inception back in 2015, when nobody was really talking about protein, as simple as that. And it, the way we see it and how we work with our investors and companies is how can we diversify protein sources effectively to address some of the climate and nature challenges that we face, but also what are the competitive advantages, what's the opportunity for long-term value creation for the food and agriculture sector, and ultimately for investors and those that look after your pension funds. So that's where our interest in this space comes in. And we've been engaging on behalf of our investor members with retailers and brand manufacturers for the last 7 years around the need to diversify protein sources in order to meet their climate and nature targets. So how do you ensure that you build resilience into product portfolios, but also ensure that you are responding to consumer demand, not for the next 5 years, but for the next 20 years, and to ultimately ensure that the companies that our investors are investing on behalf of a lot of you, are ultimately there. So that's where we come at it. And from a personal perspective, I mean, technologies coming through the pipeline are just incredibly exciting. And I mean, they're very much still in that sort of early stages, but the potential for disruption in the sector is significant.
Yeah, I think I'd come at this from the climate perspective as well, primarily. So the Good Food Institute, for those of you who don't know us, we're a non-profit think tank organisation based primarily here in Europe, but also we have teams in the US, in the Asia Pacific region, India, Israel and Brazil. So we're very much a global organisation, and you know, I think that I could be pretty punchy about this and say that alternative proteins have the potential to radically change the greenhouse gas emissions profile of agriculture all around the world, and that is a huge opportunity and one that we can really seize. If you look at plant-based meat, you're looking at emissions reductions of up to 98% in comparison to conventionally produced meat. If you're looking at, even when you compare it to something like chicken, like the most efficient way of producing protein that humans have devised so far, animal-based protein, sorry I should say, if you compare that to Quorn's fermentation-made chicken, it's 60-70% more efficient. So you've just got something that is like, you're not talking about margins of error difference, like it's a quantum leap in terms of how much better alternative proteins could be from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective. But I think we often over-focus on emissions, and I'm really glad that actually a lot of the sessions today have talked about land use, and I think that is an underappreciated angle as well, is that there are massive land use gains when you talk about alternative proteins in comparison to conventional meat and dairy. If you look at cultivated meat, based on a study in the Journal of Life Cycle Assessments that use data from cultivated meat companies, you're looking at 92% reductions in land use. Again, that is a quantum leap difference. So that climate piece from emissions and from the land, and then what we can do with that land, which maybe we can get on to talking about that a little later, I think is a major opportunity.
Thanks, Ryan. Shivani, as an investor, what's your perspective on alternative proteins?
Yeah, so I'd agree with everything that's been said so far in terms of the environmental angle, and that's core to our mission at Synthesis. So our mandate is to invest in technologies and companies that are removing animals from the food supply chain because of the environmental benefits of doing so, but then there's also a ton of other associated reasons for doing so as well. So you have, the prevalence of zoonotic diseases caused by livestock and other animals living in close quarters. We're trying to alleviate that. Then there's the nutrition angle as well. There's the fact that there's not enough food and protein in the world and to go around, and particularly in an environment where there's growing population. There's food security challenges. So from all of these angles, we have a huge amount of conviction in the potential of alternative proteins to drive really disruptive change in the long term. But then being a venture capital fund as well, there has to be a kind of financial angle to it as well. And we see that as being really, really high conviction for us. So we see the real potential to drive strong financial returns by investing in early stage companies that are developing these innovative solutions, not just the actual end products in terms of alternative protein products that you might see in supermarkets, but also the enabling technologies that are driving these products to market more quickly, more efficiently, more cheaply, and are increasing the quality of the products as well. So we're actually investing in a lot of synbio companies as well that are driving this change.
Great, and Duncan?
Oh yes, thank you very much. So I work for Forum for the Future, and we're a systems thinking organisation. So we take a systems approach to all of our work. We work globally. We've got offices in America, India, Southeast Asia, and London. And we've been working on protein since 2012. We had the Protein Challenge, which was the first of its kind in the world, which we launched as a coalition with various companies such as Volac, Unilever got involved, Waitrose and others, where we looked at how we can deliver sustainable protein in 2040. And so we've had a long-term interest in protein, recognising it as a significant challenge and a significant opportunity, and we've learnt a lot about it from different perspectives, both from seeing it from the US perspective, from an Indian perspective, from a Southeast Asian perspective, but a lot of our work has been in Europe. And so very interested in it, and it's key to future sustainability. It's one of the most important areas we've got to do. From a personal point of view, I hate the term alternative protein. It's protein. It's not alternative, it's protein. So let's just call it what it is. I feel that's a marketing ploy that's not helpful. So, and I also think I love the technology, it's really exciting, but I've been a vegetarian for 20 years. My wife is a long-standing vegan. We won't have most of these fake meats in the house because we feel the products aren't that good, particularly for children. I've got young children, and it's echoing the same mistakes as some of the other foods have. So it's fake chicken nuggets, fake chicken dinosaurs, fake this. So we have slight issues with what's being sold. We love it as a solution. We love some of the technology. But I wish the debate would go back to what can we do with beans? What can we do with lentils? They are so important. They're so natural. They're so good for the environment. And these alternate meats are really, they're part of the solution, but we've got so many other solutions we should be looking at as well, and I would rather the focus was on that than the others.
That's a really good segue into just thinking about the role of non-alternative proteins. I'm just going to call them proteins from now on. In the food system. So if we think on one hand, we're seeing encouraging, or have seen recently, really encouraging signs of the industry making some quite strategic investments and public-facing commitments to growing and investing in these new novel proteins in terms of, quite strategic acquisitions or percentage growth targets with plant-based food from a retail perspective. On the other hand, we've seen those early innovations that have accessed a lot of upfront capital now struggling in terms of sales, and also being open to the types of scrutiny that you expect from consumers that are placing the same scrutiny on novel proteins in terms of ultra processed as livestock proteins. So I guess the question for me is, do we think that this excitement around these proteins has reached its peak? And it'd be great to start with you, Linus, given your quite compelling case on the potential for these types of proteins.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's come in waves, right? So 2015, there was and up towards 2019, there was this growth in interest, and there were a couple of companies in particular that were essentially valued like big tech companies, when actually what they were doing was a step forwards, but it wasn't completely revolutionary. I mean, Beyond Meat was not a completely revolutionary company, but it was kind of positioned that way, and that's how a lot of us first interacted with it. And as a result, you then had this perfect storm of COVID, in which people were quite interested in changing and trying new things. They were worried about their health. There was quite a lot of a sort of relatively fluid venture capital environment, and then the cost of living crisis hits. And at the moment, plant-based meat in the UK probably about a third more expensive when we've looked at Nielsen data than conventional meat. And if you are looking at your bottom line in your supermarket shop, that is something that you're going to trade out, especially if you're not happy with the quality of the product. And a lot of people aren't at this point in time. And so we've started to see the cycle come back down again. And I think what will probably, my best guess, and I'd be interested in others' views on the panel, is that we'll get to a point in the next 2 to 3 years where things will just smooth out and settle down, and we'll get to where we should have been, but a perfect set of circumstances meant that you did have that initial hype cycle.
Yeah. Shivani, what's your perspective from investment? You've gone through this first wave of investment in these novel proteins. What's your view?
Yeah, I agree with what Linus said, and to build on that, I think it's important to emphasize that R&D cycles are not linear in any deep tech industry. Things come in waves, and there's periods of particular progress from an innovation perspective, from a consumer acceptance perspective, and then it kind of wanes a bit as well, and it's important to be aware of that. We've seen that happen in other industries as well, biotech, space tech, so I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from looking at other sectors as well, and right now we're at a point in alternative protein where there is a lot more consumer scrutiny. There is a lot of media scrutiny. The products are probably not quite there yet, to echo what other people have said on the panel. But I think there are also some major tailwinds as well, which suggests that we're definitely not at the peak. One of those is the pace of technological innovation is just immense, and the progress we've made just over the past 5 years or so in terms of breaking through really critical cost barriers in producing alternative proteins is just huge. So that's one major area where we see a lot of potential, and that's why we're investing in these sorts of technologies at Synthesis. So for example, technologies that are driving huge reductions in process costs of producing cultivated meat or alternative meat produced using fermentation, that sort of thing. And then I think the other thing is there's a huge amount of government support being provided as well, and particularly in the US with initiatives like the IRA and the biomanufacturing executive order that President Biden announced in September 2022. So there's a lot of interest, but there's from the government side as well, and more capital available, and that will continue to grow because in proportion to, say, the capital that's being made available by governments for energy, for example, it's still a fraction of that in food. So there's a huge amount to go, but we see that as a major tailwind.
Joe, do you want to come in?
I think just building on that is, I think we've obviously seen, sort of as Linus and Shivani have just mentioned, I think the reality is we've just been through the 1.0 version of these technologies, right? There was a lot of excitement amongst consumers. We saw a lot of the large retailers coming out with their own plant-based brands and sort of meat analogs in the market, but the products weren't good enough, so there were no repeat purchases. So that sort of curiosity, disappointment, and now it's that we've seen sales go down. But I think I want to touch on what Duncan mentioned, and I think is just other protein sources that include sort of whole grains and lentils. And I think what this has meant, though, and this is what we're seeing in our work with some of the large corporates at the moment, is that there's been a sort of refocus to move away not necessarily sort of not investing in these technologies, but also to sort of rethink what other protein sources that are easily accessible, that don't require such significant technology investment, available already in the market. So what we're seeing is, rather than having a beef patty that then was replicated to be soy-based, why not use beans? Bean-based patty. That means that number of ingredients are reduced. The sort of inputs are cheaper, and and consumers are more familiar with that. And we're also seeing a focus on substitution, sort of secondary and tertiary ingredient substitution. So, and all of this is linking back to climate mitigation strategies. So ultimately there is that recognition of what are the opportunities that diversifying protein sources in product portfolios, what are those that offer. That hasn't changed. I think that has intensified, but you're seeing corporates and investors in their own conversations with their portfolio companies sort of move away and sort of explore what other sources are out there in addition to those technologies. So I mean, just as a case in point, is we're seeing chicken soup is still chicken soup, but sort of dairy protein that will have been included in there is being replaced with vegetable protein, ultimately lowering the impact of that product, which then helps into further climate mitigation strategies. So I think there's been the sort of expansion on the term as well of when we talk about alternative proteins, which I know, Duncan, you don't like, and neither do I. It's more around sort of protein sources. What are those different sources? Technologies, novel technologies are one of them, but there's still such a wide range of sources out in the market that are so underutilized.
Duncan, any further thoughts before we move on?
No, I think we can move on.
Okay, good. You mentioned early stage innovation a few times, and I'm really interested to explore how we de-risk early stage innovation. So early stage innovation has arguably the greatest potential to deliver the step change required, but many early stage innovations fail because they don't have the right regulatory support, government support, or cash flow. So how do we collectively, or can we play a role in de-risking early stage innovation? Maybe Shivani to start.
Yeah, so I think there's several different factors at play. I think the regulatory piece, we're making progress on that, particularly within some areas of alternative protein, for example, precision fermentation, and cultivated meat as well. So progress is being made. Progress is slow, but we're making improvements. I think on the scale-up side, there's increasing kind of desire from investors to show that a process can demonstrate certain techno-economics that make sense from a margin perspective, etc., at a certain minimum viable scale before that venture is de-risked. And I think we're seeing more of that versus the 2021 approach, which was more kind of growth at all costs, and that just doesn't work anymore. We're in a more capital constrained environment, and we need to get to a point where, as I say, we can demonstrate unit economics and prove that a process is scalable without having to pour a ton of investment, in particularly equity funding, into it. So that's one area.
I just want to come in from a
two things really.
Perspective.
One, open access research. There's just an absolutely staggering lack of open access research on alternative proteins, and what we're finding is that companies are duplicating their research and development efforts all across the piece, and it's a really bad use of resources in a scarce investment environment. So the more that we can do on that, a good example, as Shivani is touching on, is around techno-economic assessments. If you look in the plant-based space, there's almost no good evidence about the techno-economics of plant-based meat, which is something that we could quite easily pool money from the public sector to fund that research. It's not especially expensive, but it would massively de-risk the space so that we know the unit economics before we start to invest in these companies and move forwards. The other one is on scale-up facilities, is super important. So if you're a cultivated meat company and let's say you're working at kind of bench level, so you're working in something that's like this big on a lab bench, and you want to be working at something that's like getting up towards the ceiling of this room, you need a lot of things in between then. You're not going to be able to afford to invest in that capital, and certainly when there are 10s, 20s of other companies in the country who are also looking at investing that capital, open access and affordable pilot facilities are a really, really good way to do that. So you can go in, trial your processors, and then come out with a proof of concept that you can then scale and de-risk the space.
Yeah. And then Duncan, taking it from startup to scale up, have you got any perspectives on how we take early innovation that's been piloted, that's been tested, that may not be perfect, but what would it take to then bring it to the level and scale
that's neat. Well,
required?
one of the things that I think we need to look at is look at the sort of the whole system here, because currently one of the arguments people are reluctant to take it to scale is saying the cost, as we've discussed here, saying the cost of the protein is more when it's compared to particularly an industrially produced livestock product. But we've got a system that is the second most subsidised system in the world, and is the global agricultural system, the industrial agricultural system. You're still seeing, for example, meat advertising being subsidised by the EU through CAP. You're seeing it happening through ADHB in the UK as well. So you're seeing this system where meat is being pushed and it's not a level playing field. A lot more money is going down to certain avenues. And if we want to scale up, we have to start looking at what about the true cost of food. And if you can actually start thinking, either taking out the subsidies so you get a more real price for some of these meat products, so you suddenly go, whoa, that's like, I know, a pound more. It can start changing things. You can change the dynamics. You bring in the true cost of food as well. So what are the environmental externalities? Suddenly some of these proteins that we're talking about that we want to scale up will look a lot more affordable to the average person who's actually going shopping to buy them. It'll make them more attractive to the average retailer who's trying to then sell them, because they're being seen as something at price parity or even, maybe even cheaper. So you can bring these economics to bear by I'm not going to say radical, a transformation of the system, because fundamentally at the moment the system is deeply unfair and plays for one or two particular sectors, and it's not a level playing field. If we can transform that, then you'll see this scale happening really, really quickly, because as customers, we shop with our wallets. We want something that's good value that our family will eat. A lot of these products are getting better, even some of them are getting more tasty, some of them are healthy. Then you've got some more products like the beans are getting better. You've got the blended products, and if they suddenly become more affordable, and you see that on the shelf, the scale happens. But it does need this fundamental systemic shift.
And how do you have any recommendations how we can make that happen?
How can we make it happen? Some of us have been calling for this for many years, and the same as calling for getting rid of subsidies on oil and gas as well, which would completely transform the renewable energy market. I know someone was talking about that earlier. The only thing is we've got organisations that have to keep pushing for it. They have to keep calling for it. It's starting to happen at the UN level. There were discussions around it at COP28. People will be bringing it up at COP16, the biodiversity COP this year. But organisations need to keep pushing for it. But we are rapidly getting close to a tipping point where you're starting to see companies who have to be on board with this, recognising that there is going to be a need to transform how we produce food and how we economically support it. So there's no quick, easy answer to it, but the tipping point is happening, but we need to keep raising it up, because the tragedy of this is most people don't know about it. Most people think that we only pay food once at the till. In fact, we pay for it 3 or 4 times through our taxes, through our subsidies, but also through healthcare costs. Mm-hmm. So it just needs to be being raised up the agenda. The more we talk about it, and the investor community has to really know about this. They have to embrace it, because if the investor community knows about it, they'll recognise how fragile the system is, and then they can push for change, because governments listen to money.
Brilliant. Just conscious of time, now would be a great time to get your questions in. We've only got one or two so far, so please submit your questions. I want to change the direction a little bit and think about farmers. We talk about de-risking for early stage innovation. What about farmers? I mentioned that, for a systemic shift, we understand the impact that livestock production creates, both good and negative from a sustainability perspective. But we take dairy for an example. There's over 200 million people working in dairy around the world, many of those smallholder farms. What do we need to do to de-risk the transition for those types of farmers? What would you say to those types of farmers about the role that alternative proteins can play in diversifying their operations going forward?
Happy to have a go at it. There's two things basically. So one is a direct opportunity. You cannot make plant-based products without crops. Plant-based foods support farmers. So I think it's very easy that there's kind of this dichotomous relationship that we kind of instinctively grasp for, and it's just not the case. Like, if you're producing oat milk, you need farmers who are growing oats and rapeseed oil and so on. So it's a really obvious thing there, and there are companies in the UK now who are starting to experiment with things like on-farm production. So there's a company down in Norfolk called Novo Farina who are producing a pea-based plant-based meat from yellow split peas that are grown in the area. The company was founded by farmers, so there's clearly an opportunity there. It's small scale at the moment. The other thing is a little bit more complex, and it's again goes back to the land use thing, which is that in this country we have a land crunch. We already borrow the same amount of farmland overseas again for what we have domestically, which is about 70% of all of our land is currently farmed. And alternative proteins allow you to kind of breathe. They allow that freeing up of some of the land. And that is, again, it goes back to the point about them being more land use efficient. And therefore, if you buy back a chunk of your land, you can enable a lot of new things to be done with that land. So biodiversity, net gain and natural environment restoration. You can look into producing less and better meat on more extensive environments, which would be impossible if you didn't have more land available to you unless you offshore a lot of your food production. So it's kind of this complicated equation, and alternative proteins kind of come into that and enable it, and it enables you to shift to more small scale, less intensive farming because you're producing food on that tiny land footprint in the first place. A plug for a report that we're publishing very soon with the Green Alliance think tank that will set that out in like tons of geeky detail. So if you want to know more about that, come and have a word with me afterwards.
Great. Joe, do you got any other perspectives?
So from our perspective, I think we've obviously talked about early stage and innovation, and I think it's also important to note the role that Big Food plays in all of this, and how are they working directly with their suppliers. And I think the reality is that farmers have not always been part of those conversations. They've not been on part of being able to be on that table, and I think it's seeing a lot more inclusivity in that regard. And I think another point as well is that we always refer to farmers as being homogeneous. They're not. There's a lot of different types of farmers, right? And I think especially with all the sort of farmer protesting happening in Europe, there are sort of your large-scale industrial farmers, and then there are your small-scale industrial farmers. It's how do you bring both of those to the table? And I think this is where supplier engagement is absolutely crucial, especially with and I'm talking here about publicly listed companies, which is where most of our investors are focused on, is how are these being engaged? I think financing is a crucial point, as if you're asking to sort of transition your product portfolio, there needs to be support around what that transition looks like. If you're shifting from farming particular animals to suddenly growing oats, for example, what does that transition look like? So there needs to be, I think, a focus around financing, and I think just bringing in a sort of broader perspective here is there's been a lot of conversations around sort of regenerative agriculture as well, and again that is also big questions around how do you scale that, and this is where financing comes into play, and it's not going to come from one single place. It's not going to be the consumers, it's not going to be the corporates, it's not going to be the investors, it's going to be everyone that is going to have to support that transition.
Go on, Duncan.
Yeah, I mean, slightly different tact. I would say, why should farmers change? I mean, the onus shouldn't be on farmers to always change. They do respond to markets, but if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, 500 million farmers, their sole asset is livestock. So why should they can't even move out of that because they won't have any other assets. So I think to always put the onus on farmers is quite unfair, and farmers are doing the right thing, particularly a lot of them in their culture and their history. They've produced this livestock, so we should be supporting them and going, yes, you're doing the right thing. The onus is more on factory farms. Do we need factory farms, and can we transition away from factory farms, which just gets you into the feed industry, say the soy industry or whatever? But it's factory farms are where the issue is, and we see the air and water pollution that they produce. A report from Sustain this week said the 10 biggest factory farming organisations produce more air and water pollution than the 10 biggest cities in the United Kingdom. So it's crazy. So you've got that, and there's also an emphasis needed on the investor community. Our Southeast Asian office did a report recently around the Protein Challenge Southeast Asia, and in that the investor community were really, really excited about alternate proteins, as we're calling them, and they were throwing loads and loads of money into it. So the second part of that we said was, how are you going to support farmers? What can farmers do? How can the investor community get there? And over 6 months, not a single investor came back to us and said, oh yeah, we've thought about that. None of them had. They'd not thought about farmers, they'd not thought about the agricultural transition, they'd not thought about the role of agroecology. And so there's a huge education piece needed for investors to recognise how they can invest in farmers who can deliver some of the solutions. And these agroecological farmers, some of them working in aquaculture, some of them small-scale chicken farmers, they need that support as well, so they can maintain what they're doing and deliver the ecosystem services and some of the nature-based solutions that they're doing.
Yeah, and I like your challenge of why should farmers change. I think also, when I started framing this conversation, we shouldn't forget the role of innovation in providing proteins for animal feed, and there's plenty of emerging innovations that have a significant potential to reduce methane emissions from livestock. So we shouldn't forget that route. We're coming up to time. I just want to now jump on to Q&A. We've had some great questions, and it links to education that you finished off with Duncan. So perhaps I will start with Joe. What is needed to manage the tensions between understanding the health impacts of ultra-processed protein alternatives and the need for sustainable food systems?
In terms of education for whom? For investors or?
I think it's open to interpretation, so it'd be good to hear your perspective.
I can start from an investor perspective. I think, first of all, ultra-processed foods, investors, again, they're like you and I. They're reading the media, they're reading what's out there, and again, there needs to be sort of a real sort of focus around what does that mean, and how they should be interacting with their portfolio companies and asking them. So, I mean, anecdotally, we know investors are very focused on asking portfolio companies to move towards healthier and more sustainable products. The challenge is that sometimes there's sort of a lack of definition on what that looks like, and also the fact that necessarily is all processed food healthy or not healthy. So these are sort of questions that they grapple with. And in terms of our work specifically, and what FAIR does is really just focusing back on that point around diversity of protein sources, and what are those different sources, and we really do break that up in terms of what are the different novel technologies, what are the whole grains, the whole foods, the vegetables, the fruits that need to be considered, and ultimately how does that feed into the portfolio impact that a food company has, and then how can investors as shareholders and debt holders ask these the right questions, and ultimately encourage changes in corporate behavior, strategy, and ultimately the business, right? Because we've talked about investing in innovation is we need to create demand at the top. Companies need to change effectively how they're producing, what they're producing, and ultimately how they're engaging with consumers, because this is a sort of a big piece. You mentioned again, Duncan, sort of subsidies going into sort of a lot of meat marketing. Again, from a large cap company, they might be investing in plant-based foods, for example, but they're spending 4 times the amount on promoting factory farmed products, for example, animal protein. So how do you rebalance that? So these are the sort of questions that we support investors with, and sort of creating a little bit of a loop is how do we educate investors so they ask the right questions, and ultimately how do those portfolio companies educate their consumers?
I think for startups that are developing alternative proteins as well, to build on Joe's point, transparency is super important. Transparency around ingredient label, around production process, around nutritional profile, and we're not quite there yet, and that's causing consumer pushback. And an example recently, not consumer pushback but media pushback, is Upside Foods, the first company in the US to get regulatory approval to sell cultivated meat. Got a lot of media scrutiny because they hadn't been fully transparent with the press, with investors, around the production process and around specifically some of the products that they were producing. And I think that's a lesson for other startups in the sector. That doesn't kind of offset the fact that they've made a huge amount of technical progress and broken through really critical cost barriers, but equally it does set them back in terms of perceptions from the public, from consumers, from governments, etc. So being open and transparent is important. And then I think the other thing in terms of from an education perspective is just to kind of emphasize this point that the future is hybrid. There's not one single solution. Cultivated meat, precision fermentation, plant-based, not any one of those individually are going to solve this problem here. There needs to be a breadth of products in the market across all of those different kind of technologies and verticals, but also even one individual product itself could be comprised of a few of those different technologies. So that's really important as well. It's not like there's a one product that will win here, and therefore from a nutritional, from a taste, from an environmental perspective, we can get to a point where we're optimizing on all of those different key critical criteria through that way.
Great, and we'll come back to the types of innovation. We're fastly running out of time. There's just a few more questions, maybe one for Linus. So traditional meat products at times feel like they can have suspect quality regulations. How tightly regulated are alternative proteins?
Extremely tightly regulated. But for most of the new novel technologies, you will need to go through a process that on average is taking 2.5 years within the Food Standards Agency. There is no precision fermentation or cultivated meat products on the market in the UK. The FSA is a rightly very conservative body. It's incredibly important that these regulatory frameworks are very tight. Plant-based meat and dairy, you are using crops and foods that we've been consuming for a very long time. Some of the more novel processing is not necessarily going to require regulatory scrutiny. That's probably an area where you're going to want to track it with scientific research. But the regulatory framework at the moment is absolutely on the side of consumers.
And then one more quickly for you, Linus, just about your open access research point. So how do you promote open access research when there's an economic advantage to keeping company secrets and retaining IP?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a big challenge. It's about probably picking the right bits to focus on with open access research. I mean, to come up with a kind of specific example, it's things like life cycle assessment data, techno-economic assessment data, characterizing microbial strains or fungal strains, characterizing particular cell lines so that everybody kind of understands it. If somebody's going to IP a particular bioprocess, then fair enough. But I think if it's things that other companies and other people could build on in order to feed the world, it shouldn't be kind of there to be IP'd directly. I might defer to these guys on kind of the prevalence of IPing in old proteins, but it's certainly something that, you know, we would push governments to try to push on that open access research as much as possible to avoid that from happening.
I think time has saved us on the IP conversation, and that sounds like a whole nother topic in itself. So, I mean, I've got one more question, but just to close this session, I think we validated that alternative proteins have a significant role to play in the future of our food system, and we need joined up thinking. We need to ensure that our innovation is integrated in a way that encourages the food system to transition rather than disrupts it in one go. And we need to lower the barriers of regulation, we need to improve cash flow for early stage innovation, and ultimately we need to educate consumers on the value that it's creating. I wanted to end this panel with one question to you all, and a brief response, please, because we're out of time. But if you had to choose one alternative protein with the most potential for the agri-food system, in terms of impact over the next 5 to 10 years, what would it be and why? So Duncan, perhaps start.
Okay, I'm going to start with what I said at the beginning, beans. Let's just scale up beans. They're amazing. There's thousands of varieties of beans. Every single culture has a history of eating beans. Dal is fantastic. If you have Mexican black beans, they're an amazing dish. It's almost the season where the broad beans are out in the UK. They're a fantastic food. They're nitrogen fixating. They don't need a lot of water. They're really, really good for biodiversity as well. The pollinators love beans. They're really healthy. And forget protein. It's not protein we need in this country. It's fibre. And beans are a fantastic source of fibre. And they're 100% natural.
Great, Shivani.
I agree with everything Duncan said, but to give a kind of alternative answer more on the on the innovation side, I think one really interesting technology that we have a lot of conviction in is molecular farming, which is effectively using plants as mini bioreactors to express protein and specific proteins, rather than having to use bioreactors as you would in fermentation, which is very capex intensive and much more challenging to scale. So that technology is super exciting, and we're seeing it applied in to produce kind of multiple different types of proteins. For example, casein, which is one of the main proteins in cheese. So that's an area we're excited about.
I'm going to massively disagree with Shivani and say I'm really excited about fermentation because we are doing it at scale. You know, there are companies who are producing mycoprotein at pretty large volumes. Corn, I mentioned at the beginning, producing on multiple like 100,000 plus litre fermenters up in the northeast. I think that's a fantastically sustainable way of producing food.
I'm going to expand from beans to just plant-based foods. To be honest, that there are just so many different types of different crops out there that are just so underutilized, and I think we should be looking at those greater diversity of plant-based foods.
Great. So the future's bright and it's diverse. So thank you very much for the panelists. Thanks for all your questions, and a round of applause. Thank you.